Last time, when Lester Eubanks escaped from an Ohio prison, the one-time death row inmate seemed to just disappear.
We checked the computer to make sure that he was entered as a wanted fugitive, and he wasn't even entered in the computer as an escaped felon, any type of crime.
And when the manhunt resumed, some of Lester's relatives suggested the U.S. Marshals were wasting their time.
You're looking for this dude, and he's been gone for, 40 years? And it's like, you haven't found him yet. What the hell makes you think you're going to find him?
I'm Sunny Hostin from ABC News. This is Have You Seen This Man? By the looks of it, Lester Eubanks was thriving in Los Angeles, but police were hitting dead ends and growing increasingly frustrated. They just weren't sure. Were there members of Lester's family who were in the dark about his whereabouts, or were there some who knew more and were engaged in a conspiracy of silence, all to protect him? Police weren't the only ones who wanted to know. Here's ABC News senior investigative reporter Matthew Moss.
Those most distraught by Lester's disappearance, understandably, were the relatives of his young victim, middle school student Mary Ellen Diener. Her family carried on in Mansfield, Ohio, bumping into members of the Eubanks family in church and around town, always wondering if they knew where he was. One day in the early 90s, Mary Ellen's sister, Myrtle Carter, had had enough. She wrote a letter that appeared in the local paper under the headline, "Killer Still Free." We asked her to read it for us.
Excuse me. You don't know me, but you know of my sister, Mary Ellen Diener. She is a very bright and beautiful young girl who loved life as we all do at the tender age of 14. But someone who had total disregard for another life decided to end hers. She is no longer with us in the physical sense, but as long as her convicted murderer is free, her soul cannot be at rest. Please, if you have any consideration for another person, consider this. We have waited long enough for someone to tell somebody the truth regarding the whereabouts of your convicted murderer, relative Lester Eubanks. I understand it may be hard to turn in someone you love to the authorities, but think of us for once. Assist in Lester Eubanks getting what he has avoided for so long. He has had 48 years. She only had 14. It's not fair. Myrtle L. Carter, Mansfield.
David Messmore was a Mansfield detective working the case. He had encouraged Myrtle to write to the paper. He thought if there were members of Lester's family who knew where he was hiding, surely this appeal would persuade them to help.
It was heartfelt, and it was very, very deep down from inside. And if that didn't, probably nothing would help. But somewhere along the line, somebody has to have a conscience.
When the letter went unanswered, his suspicions only grew.
I know there's people in town somewhere that probably know something. They know the family. They may have heard something that would be of some help in locating him, but they're either afraid to or they refuse to. But I think they're probably afraid of what may happen to them.
Like many of the police who have tracked the case, David Messmore believes Lester has maintained his connection to Ohio somehow.
Do you think he's been back?
Oh, I think he has, yeah. I have, there were rumors, but no actual evidence, and nobody actually witnessed it, but there were rumors that he had returned to see his father once in a while.
Lester's father had always drawn the most attention from authorities, but in 2012, when he died, law enforcement began to explore the possibility that there were other relatives of Lester's who might know more than they let on. Some of that fresh attention fell onto Lester's older brother, Clarence, and it was unwelcome. Clarence lives in a tight-knit working-class section of Columbus. He's had a long career as a postal carrier, and there's nothing that he did that we're aware of to generate suspicion, other than his steadfast refusal to speak with police about his brother Lester. I wanted to see if Clarence would speak with me. After he declined to answer my calls, I decided to visit his house and was greeted at the door by his adult stepson, Thomas.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm looking for Mr. Eubanks. Have I got
I'm
the wrong...
sorry. No, you got the right house, but he's not home.
Oh, he's not.
Thomas had a goatee and was wearing a blue work shirt from a roofing company. It was a warm afternoon. One neighbor was sunning herself on a lawn chair in her driveway. Thomas had a beer in one hand, and he was walking me down the driveway, away from the house, asking why I had come.
So we've been trying to work on this story about Lester.
I know it's been going on for years and years and years.
And I don't want to...
Thomas said his father had no idea where Lester was. But he said the manhunt and the suspicion it brought to his doorstep had been tough on his family. As Clarence's stepson, Thomas is not related to Lester by blood, but he considers Lester his uncle.
Police come over here and rousted us up in the middle of the night, shining lights, and had us all out there. I come outside, my dad was handcuffed in the backyard, and I was floored. I was like, what the hell is going on? Well,
This had happened just a few years ago. Police said it was in response to a tip that Lester may have been hiding there. And it wasn't the first time.
Walk me through how that happened. So it's the middle of the night,
Yeah.
just a regular night.
I'm sleeping.
And then what happens?
My door open and a big bright light, police,
They're
come
in
on
your-
out with your hands up. I'm like, what the hell? You got...
So they're in your house already?
Yeah, they were in. Evidently, they roused it. I guess they knocked on the door or something and got my dad's attention or something. But when I come out, he was already in handcuffs in the backyard. And I walked out on the back porch, and there was guys with M16s and standing around. I'm like, are you kidding me?
And what did they say?
Thomas kept me down on the sidewalk as he spoke. He said he considered the ongoing search for his uncle Lester a waste of time.
My honest opinion right now would be to say that it's an unworthy effort. I think, I don't know. Yeah, I just think after 40 years or whatever, or 30 years, or what are you going to do? Catch him and spend $1 million trying to prosecute him and put him in jail? Or I have no idea. I have no idea.
I asked if he thought Lester was still alive.
If I had to guess, the Eubanks live a long time, so I don't know.
Thomas told me he would call his dad and see if he'd talk to me about Lester. But then, just about 10 minutes after I had left his house, he called back while I was in the car. He had spoken to Clarence, who apparently felt he had already said too much.
You know what? You all me up.
Oh. I'm sorry to hear that, Tom. What do you mean?
He said, I should have said nothing. It's because we don't talk about it because, and I ain't saying no more about it.
Thomas suddenly seemed very distressed.
Well, I just wanted to let you know that I wouldn't bother calling my dad because he ain't going to give me
While it was clear that many of Lester's relatives were not helping police in their search, not all of them were resistant to talking about him. Sometimes those conversations offered clues about Lester's life on the run. One recurring theme was Lester's passion for art. We heard about this from several people who felt a kinship to Lester, like his brother John, whom we spoke with by phone. He lives in Atlanta.
And maybe there's not a lot of talk about it, but if you check into it, that once my brother got into prison, he became an artist. In fact, he was ranked the best prisoner artist in the United States. I mean, he could paint like Vincent van Gogh. That's how good he was.
Wow.
It's true, Lester was recognized for his artistic skill while in prison. Some of the few photos of Lester from that time show him exhibiting paintings at an art show for inmates. In one, he's seated on a cot in his cramped cell at the Ohio State Penitentiary, with a canvas propped on his knees, a brush in his hand. The partially painted portrait was of a woman. We were later told it was Kay Banks, the same woman who took him into her home when he escaped. Kay's son, Daryl, told us when Lester arrived in L.A., art was a big part of his life.
Have a pad and a pencil, and he would always be drawing stuff. And, you know, the portrait aspect that he would do of my mom, and I think he did one of me at one time, and, you know, just like some landscaping, stuff like that, and, you know, scenes and just things like that. Yeah, I mean, it was really cool. I at that time, I couldn't do it. I hadn't developed that yet.
Do you know if he sold any artwork? I mean, could we find his artwork, do you think, out somewhere that in a gallery or sold or?
I don't know. I'm sure he sold some of it. I know he did, but to whom, I couldn't tell you. I have no idea.
In Los Angeles, members of the Fugitive Task Force began hearing that too, that Lester had turned his passion into a source of income. Tim Connor helped that hunt back in the 1990s.
He fancied himself a fairly prolific artist. He was a painter, actually. Portrait and landscape and oils and different things.
They considered the possibility that Lester had become one of those guys on Hollywood Boulevard who sketches tourists for money. They looked for him in galleries and artist colonies.
And we thought that if he was going to find a community to mingle into, that he would still be able to engage in the arts and still be able to have kind of that outlet for himself, that another art community or another place where the arts were prevalent might be an area that he might go to.
We had heard about tips that Lester, using the name Vic Young, had become friendly with members of the band Earth, Wind & Fire. At one point, police tried to ask the band about something they had heard, that Lester may have painted an album cover for the group. We tried repeatedly to find the band's frontman, Verdine White, but the publicist said questions about Lester and the band's album art from the 1970s did not have any, quote, direct relation to the founders or principal members of the band in any way. In his email to me, he added that the band's, quote, historic musical legacy is one of inspiration and positive purpose. I had trouble shaking the notion that paintings by Lester might be out there, hanging on the walls of some unsuspecting tourist or art enthusiast. Back in Ohio, this topic came up when my colleague Alex Hosenball and I were chatting with the minister and civil rights lawyer, James Banks. He's not related to Lester, but he used to be close friends with Lester's father, and he's maintained contact with several of Lester's brothers and sisters over the years. I was curious if in all those years he'd ever seen paintings by Lester, maybe hanging in the home of Lester's father.
And he's never showed any pictures to me when I was there, or that there were any paintings or anything. I was really surprised.
James Banks was seated by the fireplace in a plush easy chair. Just then, he leaned forward and pointed up to the wall in his living room.
You see that picture right there? Yeah, okay.
I hadn't noticed it when I walked in. There was a large oil painting in an ornate frame, a portrait of him and his wife. They were painted standing side by side. He had salty hair and wore a clerical collar. He looked serious. His wife smiled warmly, a gold cross hanging from a chain around her neck. That painting, James Banks told me, was a gift from Mose Eubanks, Lester's father. Mose had told him an inmate he knew